How did a people living at the edge of the frozen world endure winters that could last half the year while still growing food, waging war, and raising children in a landscape of ice, darkness, and scarcity? To understand the Vikings, we must first understand their winters, not the romanticized image of roaring hearths and feasting warriors, but the long, grinding reality of cold that seeped into bones, shortened days to a few hours of gray light, and turned survival into a daily calculation. For the Norse, winter was not a season, it was a test, one that shaped every aspect of their lives. By late autumn, the world of the Vikings was already closing in. In Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and the North Atlantic settlements of Iceland and Greenland, the land hardened early. Frost crept across fields, rivers slowed, then froze. Snow buried paths and erased boundaries between farm and wilderness. Travel became dangerous, sometimes impossible. Once winter truly set in, communities were largely cut off from the outside world. What you had stored was what you would live on. What you had built would shelter you, or fail you. This reality demanded preparation on a scale few modern societies can imagine. Viking survival began months before the first snow fell. Summer and autumn were seasons of relentless labor. Farming was the backbone of Norse life, even for those who raided or traded abroad. Barley, rye, and oats were harvested quickly in short growing seasons. Livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs were fattened on open pastures while grass was abundant. But winter could not support large herds. Many animals were slaughtered in late autumn, their meat salted, dried, or smoked. Fish, especially cod and herring, were preserved in vast quantities, becoming a critical winter protein. Dairy products like butter, cheese, and skyr were stored, often buried, or kept in cold spaces to slow spoilage. Haymaking was perhaps the most vital task of all. Without enough hay, animals would starve before spring. Viking sagas speak of winters where poor harvests led to desperate choices. Animals killed early, families reduced to eating seed grain, and entire settlements abandoned. Winter famine was not rare. It was a constant threat, remembered in stories long after it had passed. Viking houses were not designed for comfort, they were designed for endurance. Long houses were built low to the ground, often partially sunken into the earth for insulation. Thick walls of turf, stone, and timber trapped heat and blocked wind. Roofs were layered with sod, turning homes into extensions of the land itself. Inside, the hearth was the heart of life. Fires burned day and night, providing heat, light, and a place to cook. Smoke drifted upward through roof vents, filling interiors with soot, but also helping preserve wooden beams and deter insects. Families, servants, and sometimes animals shared the same space. Body heat mattered, privacy did not. Winter nights were long, sometimes nearly endless. In northern regions, daylight shrank to a few dim hours. Artificial light came from oil lamps fueled by animal fat. Every resource was precious. Nothing was wasted. Contrary to popular belief, winter was not idle time. While fields lay frozen, indoor labor intensified. Tools were repaired. Weapons were sharpened. Wool was spun, woven, and sewn into clothing that could mean the difference between life and death. Clothing was layered and practical. Wool tunics, cloaks fastened with brooches, fur-lined garments, and leather boots stuffed with grass or straw for insulation. Color and decoration mattered too, not just for beauty, but for identity and status in tightly bound communities. Children learned by watching and helping. Winter was when stories were told, oral history passed down beside the fire. Tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors reinforced values of endurance, honor, and courage. These stories were not entertainment alone. They were instruction manuals for survival. Winter did not stop conflict. In some ways, it intensified it. Raiding often paused during the coldest months, but feuds did not. Isolated farms could become targets. With travel restricted, disputes festered. Viking law assemblies, or things, were often held in warmer seasons, but winter violence still erupted, sometimes over food, land, or old grudges made sharper by hunger and fear. Yet winter also created warriors. Training did not stop. Strength was maintained through labor, endurance was forged through hardship. A man who could survive winter was a man who could survive battle. The gods themselves reflected this harsh worldview. Norse mythology is filled with ice giants, frozen realms, and the looming threat of Ragnarok, a cosmic winter that would end the world. For the Vikings, the cold was not just physical, it was spiritual. Life existed in constant tension with destruction. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Viking winter survival was the persistence of family life. Children were born in winter, elderly relatives were cared for, meals were shared, however meager, marriage alliances were negotiated. Life continued, not because it was easy, but because it had to. Women played a central role in winter survival. They managed food stores, clothing production, and household order. In the absence of men, away trading or raiding, they held authority over farms and families. Survival depended on cooperation more than brute strength. Community bonds mattered deeply. Neighbors shared resources in hard years, knowing that next winter the roles might reverse. To be cast out in winter was effectively a death sentence. Not every winter was survived. Archaeology and written sources tell of abandoned farms, mass graves, and settlements that vanished after a series of harsh seasons. In Greenland, Norse colonies eventually failed, partly due to climate cooling, partly due to inflexible traditions that could not adapt fast enough. Yet for centuries, Vikings endured. They endured not because they were immune to cold or hunger, but because their entire culture was built around anticipating them. Winter shaped their farms, their homes, their gods, their laws, and their families. It taught patience, resilience, and ruthless practicality. It forced cooperation and punished waste. It reminded every generation that survival was never guaranteed, only earned. And when spring finally came, when ice cracked, light returned, and ships were repaired, the Vikings emerged hardened, ready once more to farm, to fight, and to venture beyond the horizon. For the Vikings, survival was not just about courage or strength. It was about systems, food systems, farming strategies, risk management learned through generations of failure and hard-won success. Every field, every animal, every stored barrel represented not comfort, but insurance against the coming cold. By the early medieval period, Norse society had evolved into a finely balanced network of agriculture, animal husbandry, fishing, hunting, and trade. This balance was fragile. One bad harvest might be endured. 2 could bring starvation. 3 could end a settlement. Viking farming existed at the northern limit of what was possible in medieval Europe. Growing seasons were short, sometimes no more than 3 or 4 months. Frost could strike early or late, destroying crops in a single night. To cope, Vikings favored hardy grains. Barley was the most common crop, able to grow quickly and tolerate poor soil. Rye and oats followed, especially in slightly milder regions. Wheat, which demanded better conditions, was rare and valuable. Fields were small and carefully managed. Stone-lined boundaries protected soil from erosion. Manure from livestock was spread to maintain fertility. In some areas, slash-and-burn methods were used to temporarily enrich land, though this carried long-term risks. Crop failure was expected, not exceptional. That expectation shaped Viking behavior. They planted multiple fields in different locations to reduce risk. They stored seed separately and guarded it fiercely. To eat seed grain in winter was an act of desperation, one that might doom the following year. Livestock were central to Viking survival, but they were also liabilities in winter. Animals consumed precious fodder and space. Each winter forced hard decisions about which lives could be spared. Cattle were the most valuable animals, providing milk, cheese, butter, meat, hides, and status. Sheep supplied wool and meat. Goats were hardy and adaptable. Pigs foraged freely in summer forests, converting wild food into fat reserves for winter slaughter. Come autumn, herds were reduced. Weak animals were killed first. The rest were brought into byres or stalls, sometimes within the longhouse itself. Their body heat helped warm living spaces, while humans protected animals from predators and weather. This close relationship between people and livestock was intimate and constant. Children helped feed animals through the dark months. Losing livestock to disease or starvation could destroy a household's future, not just its present. When fields failed, the sea often saved the Vikings. Coastal and river fishing was a year-round activity, though winter fishing was dangerous. Cod, herring, salmon, and trout were preserved in massive quantities, air-dried on wooden racks, salted in barrels, or fermented. Dried cod, light and durable, became a critical survival food and later a major export. Hunting supplemented diets, especially in inland and Northern regions, elk, reindeer, deer, seals, and seabirds provided meat, fat, and skins. Walrus hunting in the North Atlantic was particularly important not only for food, but for ivory, which connected remote settlements to European trade networks. These activities were not optional, they were insurance policies against agricultural collapse. Vikings did not have refrigeration, but they mastered preservation. Salt was precious and sometimes scarce, so drying and smoking were widely used. Meat and fish were hung in cold, windy environments where bacteria struggled to survive. Fermentation played a key role. Sour milk products like skyr could last for months. Meat and fish were sometimes fermented intentionally, producing strong flavors modern palates might find shocking, but which provided calories when nothing else remained. Grain was stored in raised granaries to protect it from moisture and rodents. Even so, losses were common. Mold, pests, and damp could ruin entire stores. Winter hunger was often gradual, not sudden. Meals became smaller, meat gave way to porridge. Fat disappeared first, then variety. Survival depended on rationing, decisions made daily, not heroically, but carefully. The Vikings did not live in a stable climate. From roughly the 9th to the 13th centuries, the North Atlantic experienced periods of relative warmth, sometimes called the medieval warm period. These conditions helped Norse expansion into Iceland and Greenland, but warmth was inconsistent. Cold decades returned, storms intensified, growing seasons shortened. In marginal regions, the margin vanished. Greenland offers the clearest example. Norse settlers farmed as they had in Scandinavia, raising cattle and sheep. As temperatures fell, grass yields declined. Sea ice limited trade and fishing. Rather than fully adopting Inuit hunting strategies, many Norse clung to familiar methods. Eventually, their food systems failed. This was not ignorance, it was cultural. Momentum. Farming was identity. To abandon it was to abandon what it meant to be Norse. Trade expanded Viking resilience. Furs, walrus ivory, amber, iron, and dried fish were exchanged for grain, salt, metal goods, and luxury items. These networks stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean. In good years, trade buffered bad harvests. In bad years, isolation became deadly. Storms, war, or political collapse could sever lifelines overnight. Even so, trade encouraged specialization. Some regions focused on fishing, others on farming or animal products. Interdependence grew, along with risk. Food was never just physical, it was moral and spiritual. Hospitality was sacred in Norse culture. Sharing food, even in winter, was a mark of honor. To refuse a guest was shameful, but generosity could also threaten survival. These tensions appear repeatedly in sagas, where famine tests not only bodies but character. The gods were believed to influence harvests and weather. Sacrifices, sometimes animals, sometimes more, were offered to secure favor. Winter hardship reinforced belief in a world governed by forces beyond human control. Yet Vikings did not surrender to fate alone. They planned, they adapted, they endured. Viking food systems worked, not because they were efficient, but because they were flexible. Farming was never relied upon alone. The sea, the forest, the herd, and the trade route all mattered. Still, the system had limits. When climate, isolation, and cultural rigidity aligned, collapse followed. But for generations, these systems held. They allowed Viking families to survive winters that would have broken many societies. They fed warriors who would sail thousands of miles. They sustained children who would inherit the same cold land and the same relentless cycle. For the Vikings, survival was not just farming, hunting, or preserving food. It was social, it was political, it was cultural. Winter shaped the very fabric of Norse society, determining who lived, who led, and who could fight. Understanding Viking resilience requires seeing how their communities, laws, and warrior ethos all evolved to endure harsh realities. At the heart of Viking survival was the household. The concept of heim, or home, encompassed more than a dwelling. It was the center of production, protection, and inheritance. Viking households were multi-generational. Grandparents, parents, children, and sometimes distant relatives shared the longhouse. Labor was distributed according to skill and age. Men managed livestock and tools. Women oversaw food stores and textile production. Children learned essential skills, and elders contributed wisdom and guidance. In winter, the household became a fortress against cold and isolation. Everybody mattered. each person a source of heat, labor, or knowledge. Cooperation was a survival imperative. Individual failure could imperil the entire family. Marriage and kinship were not only personal, they were strategic. Alliances forged through marriage strengthened households against famine, raids, and legal disputes. Children were trained from birth to understand the risks and responsibilities of their environment. They learned hunting, farming, navigation, and combat, not as hobbies, but as necessary skills for life in a harsh and unpredictable world. Beyond the household, Vikings relied on extended communities. Winter was too long and harsh for farms to exist in isolation. Villages, though small, were interdependent. Shared storage facilities, collective haymaking, and joint defense against predators or raiders were essential. The thing, or assembly, was the backbone of Norse governance. These gatherings, held during milder months, established laws, resolved disputes, and coordinated collective action. Winter may have paused large-scale decision-making, but the outcomes of these assemblies guided months of survival. Laws dictated property rights, inheritance, and food sharing, all critical when resources were scarce. Mutual obligation was cultural and legal. Neighbors were expected to assist one another in times of scarcity. Failing to do so could result in fines, feuds, or social shame. This reciprocity was a survival mechanism. A community that refused to cooperate would fail, and those who learned to share endured. Viking law was practical and intimately tied to environmental constraints. Theft of food during winter, for instance, was severely punished, not just for moral reasons, but because a stolen barrel of grain could mean death. Feuds and revenge killings were regulated to prevent total social collapse. Property law, inheritance, and dispute resolution all reflected the reality of scarcity. Land and livestock were carefully accounted for, families prepared for winter months through clear rules about storage, ownership, and communal responsibilities. Even religion was interwoven with survival law. Sacrifices and offerings were sometimes legally mandated. Blame for poor harvests or livestock disease could fall on neglecting rituals as much as on natural misfortune. The gods were partners in survival, and social law enforced that partnership. Winter forged warriors as much as it threatened households. While summer raiding and exploration brought fame, winter demanded endurance. Men and women trained with tools, weapons, and physical labor to maintain strength during months of confinement. Combat skills were part of daily life, not a separate pursuit. Handling axes, spears, and shields was intertwined with farming labor, chopping wood, butchering animals, or clearing snow all doubled as functional training. Strength, stamina, and resilience were cultivated not in gyms, but through necessary survival tasks. In some ways, winter made the Viking warrior. Surviving months of scarcity, managing risk, and enduring harsh weather prepared individuals for the unpredictability of battle. A man who could endure a Greenland winter could endure a storm at sea or a raid across hostile territory. The Norse worldview reflected the harsh realities of their environment. Myths of frost giants, endless winter, and the coming of Ragnarok were not abstract fantasy. They were metaphors for natural forces that governed life. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals aligned with agricultural cycles reinforced community cohesion. Yule, the midwinter festival, was both a religious observance and a practical tool. Feasts and celebrations strengthened social bonds, distributed stored food, and provided morale during the darkest months. Belief in divine forces shaped decisions, but practical action remained paramount. Offerings might ensure luck, but storing hay, reinforcing roofs, and rationing grain ensured survival. Vikings were neither fatalistic nor naive. They combined faith with preparation. Viking resilience depended on adaptation. In Iceland, they quickly learned to utilize driftwood for construction, fish for winter protein, and geothermal warmth where available. In Greenland, settlers experimented with different livestock, fishing methods, and irrigation techniques, sometimes successfully, sometimes fatally too late. Tools evolved to meet environmental challenges. Iron plows, wooden sledges, and snowshoes allowed work to continue despite frost and snow. Clothing adapted to extremes. Layered wool, furs, and leather insulated against wind, while techniques for tanning and waterproofing extended garment life. Even navigation and exploration were adaptations to winter conditions. Knowledge of currents, ice, and weather was crucial to trade and raiding, especially when long ships had to survive icy waters. Not all communities survived. In Greenland, Norse colonies eventually vanished. Archaeological evidence suggests famine, climate change, and cultural rigidity contributed to their decline. In Scandinavia, isolated farms occasionally failed, forcing migration or consolidation. These failures reinforced cultural memory. Sagas often recount winters of famine, heroic endurance, and strategic miscalculations not as stories of despair, but as lessons. They reinforced the importance of preparation, foresight, and social cohesion. Ultimately, winter shaped Viking identity. It demanded courage, labor, and strategy. It tested community bonds, family loyalty, and personal resilience. It produced a culture that valued endurance, cleverness, and adaptability. Vikings became explorers, raiders, and traders, not despite the winter, but because of it. Their harsh environment forced them to innovate in agriculture, animal husbandry, maritime navigation, and social organization. Winter forged the skills, mentality, and cohesion that allowed a relatively small population to leave a lasting mark across Europe and the North Atlantic. Viking survival was a long game. While history remembers their raids and conquests, the daily, relentless struggle against cold, famine, and isolation was far more demanding. Every stored barrel, every repaired roof, every rationed meal represented a victory against nature itself. In this sense, the true story of the Vikings is one of human endurance. They farmed, fought, and raised families in a land that could just as easily destroy them. They built societies around scarcity, creating laws, alliances, and rituals that reinforced survival. They learned to live in the margin of possibility, and sometimes, just barely, they succeeded. Winter shaped everything: homes, laws, family structures, religion, warfare, and exploration. Without understanding the role of the cold, the snow, and the short growing season, it is impossible to fully appreciate the ingenuity and courage of the Norse people. Their legacy is not only in the lands they raided or settled, but in the resilience they demonstrated, proving that even at the edge of the world, life could endure, thrive, and leave a mark for centuries to come.